Yep, I see it now.
Yeah, I paused it because we were just doing chit chat. So it is recording now. We're live. Go ahead.
All right. Welcome everybody to this webinar on the Paycheck Protection Program. The intention of this webinar is to give all of the participants information on who is eligible, how to apply, what some of the common misconceptions are, and to really encourage people to apply as a result of determining eligibility. This webinar is sponsored by the Farmers Legal Action Group, University of Minnesota Extension, the Minnesota Farmers Market Association, Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, and Sustainable Farming Association. I'm Teresa Caveney, the Executive Director of SFA, and my sole job is to really do introductions. I do want to make sure folks are aware that we will have another webinar like this tomorrow evening from 7 to 8:15. Our presenters today are Lindsay Keene. Lindsay is a staff attorney with Farmers Legal Action Group. She is a former hog farmer turned lawyer, and she will lead off and give the kind of legal background on PPP. Megan Roberts is an extension educator and for ag business management with University of Minnesota Extension, and she farms with her husband south of Mankato. And Dan Zimmerly is my coworker. He is a community organizer with Sustainable Farming Association, and he and his partner Laura farm near Waldorf. One thing that I am happy about in terms of this presentation is that a number of the people on this presenting panel and attending have applied for and learned a little bit about the ropes of PPP and have helped others. So I will turn it over to Jane. If you have any housekeeping items, Jane Jewett is going to be moderating and helping field questions. And Jane is the Deputy or Associate Director of MISA. So any housekeeping items?
Yep, hello. I'll just keep it really, really quick and remind all attendees to please mute your microphone. And we don't have a video issue at all because I didn't get the video installed correctly for this Zoom webinar, so we have no video. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be monitoring those and bringing those up to the presenters as needed. So that's all I've got, and let's go ahead.
Very good. Lindsay.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Keene. I work with the Farmers Legal Action Group based in St. Paul, and I'm just going to give us a brief overview of the Paycheck Protection Program, but I wanted to take a minute and frame it kind of in the larger picture of what was happening when this program was created. So as many of you know, at the end of March, Congress passed the CARES Act, and within the CARES Act were two really large relief programs. One of them, which we are talking about today, is the Paycheck Protection Program, and the other was the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, or EIDL, EIDL. And the reason I wanted to just briefly mention both is that I think it's easy to assume, because they were passed at the same time and they're both related to COVID-19, to think they are similar, when in reality they are quite distinct programs with different eligibility requirements, different goals for the programs themselves. So just wanted to start us off by making sure we're all on the same page about that. So the Paycheck Protection Program, this is a program that provides a potentially 100% forgivable loan to cover about 2.5 months worth of your payroll costs. This program, farmers are eligible, independent contractors, self-employed people are eligible, as well as small businesses, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I think an important thing to think about with the Paycheck Protection Program is that it was intended to help employers retain their employees. So this is at a time when COVID-19 was ramping up and we were all feeling the effects, businesses were being forced to shut down. And so it seems like what Congress was trying to do was to say, we expect this is going to hit businesses hard, and we want to try to prevent some of that harm. But what PPP doesn't require is that you show substantial economic harm due to COVID-19. That requirement comes from the EIDL program. And the way that EIDL is different from PPP is not only that you need to show harm, but this is also a traditional loan. So unlike the Paycheck Protection Program loan where you can get it forgiven, an EIDL loan is not forgivable. They're generally low interest loans, 3.75%, but you can't have that loan forgiven. Up until recently, there was another aspect of the EIDL program that allowed for what they called emergency advances. So these were essentially grants you could get for about $1,000 per employee. But earlier this month, that funding ran out. So as it stands now, EIDL is more of a traditional loan program, and then we have the PPP, which provides the option for forgiveness. So moving on, one of the things that we've seen happen is, we had the CARES Act in March, and then we had the Enhancement Act, we've had the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act. There have been all these things going on, and I think all the different rules coming out and the changes have made it confusing at times. And so we have this list here, I think you all can see, about some of the common myths. So these are situations where people think they might not qualify. For example, if you don't have employees, or if your farm is seasonal, or if you have a small farm, if you don't want debt. Another common thing we've heard is that early on in the program, people were told that, maybe the program wasn't for them, maybe they wouldn't be eligible. All of those reasons standing alone should not prevent you from applying for the Paycheck Protection Program as long as you meet the eligibility requirements. This program allows businesses, seasonal employers, and farmers to apply. And again, the myth about whether or not you're suffering due to COVID-19, we'll get into that a little later. But the bar is pretty low as far as that's concerned. And I think just keeping in mind that this was trying to just help employers keep their employees. So if you think about the intent of the program, it kind of helps to answer that. And as far as, the question of, well, aren't most people being denied? I don't have the statistics right now on how many people or what percentage of applicants have been denied, but what we do know is that farmers have applied and farmers are receiving money. So I would keep that in mind.
Lindsay, you can start your video now. So go ahead and do that.
And I think Megan, you are on mute. So I will introduce Megan right now. We'll turn it over to her.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Roberts. I'm a University of Minnesota Extension educator, as Teresa said, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges in the early days of PPP. So I think Lindsay started to hit on these with some of the myths, and I think because of this fast rollout, because we had multiple different large programs that are brand new coming out of the CARES Act, farms weren't before able to apply for EIDLs. Now we have this PPP thing. And so there were challenges. We had a really fast rollout of a very large program. There's bound to be hiccups. This program, unlike some other SBA programs, is actually administered by local lenders, not by SBA. So that's another compare and contrast between PPP and EIDL. With the Paycheck Protection Program, you do need to apply through a lender. And not every lender is going to do things exactly the same way as a lender down the street. And so we have little differences between the banks, credit unions, farm credit service, et cetera, that are providing these PPP loans. There was also a misconception in those very early days back in April that farms did not qualify. And that's because of some of the legislation written around SBA loans. There are a whole classification of SBA loans 7B that farms do not qualify. But this is written specifically for 7A. which does allow a sole proprietor farm, a small farm LLC, etc., to be able to apply and be eligible for PPP. We also had some questions about what was the payroll expenses that were allowed. Those things have really been clarified now, so we have a really good idea of what we can and cannot apply for. And then another challenge was that this program in its first iteration did run out of money. And Lindsay mentioned that we've had those multiple different laws related to PPP that have been passed. And back in April, we had a new law that was passed, and it gave quite a bit of generous money to the PPP fund, and we're still working our way through those funds now. So there is definitely still funds available for PPP.
Okay, so right now we're going to go into some of the basics on eligibility, so you all can kind of start to think through whether or not this is a program that would be fitting for you. So the first thing is you have to be an eligible business, and this could come in one of a variety of forms. In general, SBA allows smaller businesses, and by definition that would be businesses with 500 or fewer employees. These can include nonprofits, tribal organizations, veterans organizations. Also eligible are, as you know, we've been talking about, agricultural producers, farmers and ranchers. And again, the rules for having 500 and fewer employees would also apply. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, you can be a self-employed person, you can be a sole proprietor or an independent contractor and also be eligible. And I think one of the things I want to mention here is, you know, as you look at this list, farmers are an interesting group because you could, in theory, you know, fall in all of these categories. And I think it's important to remember that when this program was created, it was not created for farmers. Although you are absolutely eligible, it didn't have you in mind. And so what we're finding is that it's sort of like putting a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes some of the rules get extra confusing because we're trying to figure out how they apply to your situation. But I just want to encourage you not to have that discourage you from applying in and of itself. So you need to be an eligible business. If you meet that bar, the next requirement is that you had to have been in business as of February 15th of this year. And I know sometimes we've gotten questions for folks and some farmers who are more seasonal and maybe weren't ramped up at that date. That doesn't disqualify you. What SBA has said is that if you are a seasonal employer, you can use any 8-week period between May 1st and September 15th of 2019. So there is an option if you are a seasonal employer. And then finally, you know, and this is something I think we've heard that some folks have a little caution around, and that is that, you know, on the application, it requires you to certify that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan necessary to support the ongoing operations or your ongoing operations. And I think what I want to point out about this is that this requirement is very different from, say, something that says you need to show economic harm. You know, what this is saying is that, you know, is there uncertainty in your business, essentially, and will this help to support your operation? So I just want to make that distinction if you're concerned that, for example, you can't show a specific loss. You know, that does not bar you from applying. So I just want to make that clear. Okay, some other important,
Lindsay, I want to throw in a question here. There was a question in the Q&A, and it also was one on the registration form. People who have startup businesses that are new this year are wondering if they qualify.
Yes, so I'm actually going to get to that kind of right now. There are some confusing rules around for newer businesses, so hang tight on that one, because one of the things about the Paycheck Protection Program is that the way it determines your loan amount is based on your 2019 payroll costs. And so for someone who's in a startup or a newer business, you know, they're not going to have 2019 payroll costs, obviously. The tricky thing is that if you are a business with employees, this should not be a bar. What the rules say is that as long as you are in business on February 15th, even if you don't have payroll costs from 2019, if you have employees, the program will allow you to use the average payroll from between January 1st of this year and February 29th of this year. So if you're a startup with employees, and that's the key, is that you have employees, there should not be an issue with your eligibility, even if you don't have 2019 payroll costs. The tricky thing is if you're self-employed. And what the rules, unfortunately, perhaps make very clear is that in order to qualify for PPP, you must have your Schedule F or Schedule C from 2019. And so essentially, it appears that SBA is concerned about having verifiable documentation that you are a business, that you were in business, that these expenses you're incurring, you are in fact incurring. And so they have just made it clear that they're not going to allow anyone, a new sole proprietorship, for example, who doesn't have a 2019 Schedule F or Schedule C to apply. The rules did say that SBA would be issuing additional guidance on what to do if you fall into that category. So if you're a self-employed person that started your business this year, but as of yet, they have not issued those. So we don't have much good information other than just to let you know they say it's coming. Okay, so that's the overview of how you determine the loan amount, and we'll go into a little more detail on that in a minute. But the other thing to consider is, once you get the PPP loan, there are certain eligible uses. So the ways that you use the money. And the first are through payroll costs. And so your payroll costs can include salaries, wages, tips, and there's a whole range of employee benefits. So vacation time, parental leave, family or medical leave, retirement. You can also use the money on state and local taxes on the employee compensation. And then there's also the other category would be things such as rent payments, utility payments, or mortgage interest payments. And I want to make clear, when we talk about eligible uses of the money, we're talking about if you want to get that 100% forgiveness. So any money that you use from a PPP loan that you end up not using for one of the quote unquote eligible reasons, that loan might turn into just more of a traditional loan with a 1% interest rate. So I just want to make that clear for folks who might have had questions. Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of the three scenarios that we sort of think most farmers are probably fitting into, and how exactly you would figure out what your loan might be. So the first is, can you qualify if you have no employees? And, we don't want to beat you over the head with this, but the answer is most likely yes, with a big caveat. And that caveat is that, as I mentioned a minute ago, SBA, if you are a self-employed person, relies a lot on your 2019 Schedule F, especially for farmers. And they seem to believe that if you, or the way they're running the program, I should say, is that if you do not have a net farm income, a positive net farm income from your 2019 Schedule F, then you are not eligible for PPP. And this means line 34 of Schedule F. And Megan might go into this in a little more detail, but as it stands now, I don't believe they're allowing you to exclude any of the depreciation if you had not on your 2019 taxes. So that is one of the rules that I imagine is a bar for many farmers. But if you are a farmer who did have positive net farm income on your Schedule F, then keep listening because you meet one of the hurdles. The other rules for self-employed are just that, again, you were in operation on February 15th of this year, that you have your principal place of residence in the United States, and that you have some sort of self-employment income. So that in addition to having the positive farm income from 2019. So if you are eligible, the way that SBA in general will calculate your loan amount is to just take that average monthly net profit from 2019 and multiply it by 2.5. And that would be what your loan amount would come to. So that's for folks with no employees. Then the question is, what if you are a farmer and you do have employees? And chances are, again, yes, you would be eligible if you declared your payroll. Again, SBA will rely on your 2019 Schedule F. And what's important to keep in mind about this is, as long as you have employees that are on payroll, even if on your Schedule F you didn't have positive net farm income, that's okay. And the reason, again, is that's the line that SBA looks at to figure out if you were paying yourself. And remember, you know, these programs weren't written for farmers, so we know there are many farmers who do not show that positive income on the form. But nonetheless, those are the rules as they exist now. So if if you show a 0, but you have employees that you're paying, you can still be eligible. The difference would be that the maximum amount that you're going to receive is probably just going to take into account your employees and not you, if that were the case. So as you can see, if you are watching, for employers with employees, SBA will take the average monthly payroll, and this amounts, or they will count any employee with a principal place of residence in the US. So just like when you're self-employed, you have to have a principal place of residence in the US. To include the wages of any employee, they also have to meet their requirement. So they will take the average payroll for those employees and multiply it by 2.5, and that would be your PPP loan amount. And then finally, the question of what if you only have seasonal employees? So again, the answer is most likely. You know, we're using our Schedule F still. But one key difference is that, you know, when we talked about a lot of times SBA will use the payroll from, you know, the last year, what they do for seasonal employers is you have a choice. You can either use the average of your payroll costs from between February 15th of 2019 and June 30th, or you can use any 12-week period between May 1st and September 15th of last year. So you have a little flexibility, not a lot, but a little in there if you would prefer to use either of those. And then again, the loan calculation is very similar. You're taking the average from whichever time frame that you use and multiplying it by 2.5. So that gives you kind of a broad overview of, you know, how the PPP loans are calculated. And I think now Megan is going to get into the nitty-gritty of what to do when you're applying.
Yeah, so we're just going to overview a lot of the same things that Lindsay went into, but use a few examples here. So what information do I need to fill in the application? As you were listening to Lindsay, you probably heard some repetition there. Your Schedule F, and if you have employees, your Form 943, which is how you declare your payroll as an agricultural business to the IRS. So those two forms are really going to help most farms through the majority of the PPP application. Are there some exceptions? Absolutely. So let's say you make pre-tax benefits contributions, then you would need to additionally find that information. So that would require some additional tax information. Let's say you're one of those farms that just started, and so you were in business by February 15th, you have employees, but you don't have those 2019 tax documents. Well, obviously there you're going to have some different forms that you're going to need to fill out your application. The other thing is that we've mostly been talking as farms being organized into sole proprietorships with or without employees, but there are many farms that use business structures. So you might be organized as an LLC, you might be organized as an S Corp or a C Corp, and then you're going to have additional forms like your K1 in order to properly fill out your application, because it is the farm entity in that case that it's applying, not you as an individual owner. So there are some additional forms. I'm going to just hit on the most common, and then if there are additional detailed questions, we can get into those during the Q&A. So this is a busy slide, I know, but I took a screenshot of the Schedule F, and I just wanted to highlight which lines are important for filling out your PPP application. Without employees, there is really one key line, and that is line 34. So we see that down at the bottom here, our net farm profit or loss. If you don't have that on your 2019 Schedule F and you do not have employees, you are really not going to be eligible for PPP. Now, there have been some questions about things like, what about depreciation? That really reduced my net farm profit. Or what about these other expenses? But as you can see, those expenses are all deducted before we get to line 34. So we can't add them back in and adjust our net farm profit or loss. At that point, we wouldn't be looking at our net farm profit. So that's what's important, line 34. With employees, it gets a little bit more in depth. Usually you're going to look at line 34 and then add in your form 943, which is going to show all of your payroll from last year. But you do have additional details. One thing, I'm just going to go back here and I'm going to make sure that this link is shared with the participants. SBA has a really nice, helpful guide that takes you line by line through the Schedule F, through the Schedule C, and shows you how to apply based on your business structure, whether you're a sole proprietorship, whether you're an LLC, whether you're a C or S Corp. So really find that guide to be helpful, and it does take you, as I said, line by line. So let's just do a very simple math equation, but this does show you how easy the calculations can be once you have all of the right forms in front of you. So I just took a round number. Let's say you have no employees and your Schedule F showed a net farm profit of $42,000 for last year. You would then divide that by 12 and multiply by 2.5. That's 2.5 months worth of your payroll, essentially what you're paying yourself by having net farm profits from last year. Your PPP amount would be $8,750. Now, obviously it gets more complicated if you have employees. But one thing that Lindsay and I talked about as we were preparing for this webinar was really, you get to choose a little bit how complicated you want to make this. So I used an example. I have a small fair to finish hog farm with my family. We do have employees on our farm, and we decided that back in April, we were worried that the program might run out of money. It did in round one, and so we just wanted to get our application in as quick as possible. So we took our form 943, we divided by 12, multiplied by 2.5. We didn't look at anything extra like benefits. We didn't look at our owner's compensation. We just took our employee compensation, divided by 12, and multiplied by 2.5. Because for a farm of our size, that was good enough. It was good enough to just make sure we got our application in and that we could get it done before the money ran out. Now, in contrast, my brother runs a dairy farm and he has a lot more employees. And when they applied, they very carefully looked at benefits. Because of those multiple employees, that started adding up to a lot more money. And so they very carefully took both their Form 943 as well as those pre-tax employee benefits. And we spent a longer time on their application, but it was worthwhile for the size of their operation. So you really need to decide what works best for your farm. How much time do you have to spend on your PPP application? And if you're just looking to meet the bare requirements, you can show your Schedule F was this, and that's the form that you want to utilize. You don't have to go into the details of pre-tax benefits and things like that. So some quick tips for successfully applying: gather all the needed tax documentation ahead of time. Now, there is an SBA application on the SBA website, and you can fill that out ahead of time. That's going to help you know exactly what's needed, but be aware that some lenders use their own forms. So you might have filled out an SBA application, and then when you're working with your local lender, you find that they have a different form. It might be online. It might ask things in a slightly different way. But if you've already filled out the SBA application, odds are you're going to have the information that you need in order to fill out a lender's form. Advocate for your eligibility. If you are being told no, but you know that you meet these eligibility requirements, try to advocate for yourself. That can be difficult, of course. Sometimes you just feel like you've hit a roadblock and you can't move forward, but If you know that you meet the requirements, try to work towards getting to a lender that understands that you really do have the eligibility requirements. And then finally, don't wait until the week of August 8th. You're going to want to work on this pretty quickly here because August 8th is when the lender has to have things through to SBA. So you are not meeting that requirement just with your lender. They actually really have probably an earlier deadline that you need to work for. Some potential issues that have occurred. There was this misconception that ag was not eligible. I think by this point in the program, that misconception is no longer a misconception. Some other potential issues, sometimes they prefer to work with existing clients. So if you don't have a lender relationship, it might be challenging to start a new one up, but there are definitely lenders that are looking to work with individuals on PPP, so you might have to look around a little bit. Another issue is that there might not be accessible applications. Even National SBA, which isn't actually the administrator of this program, it's sub-administered by the lenders. National SBA currently, as of last week, did not have a Hmong or Somali translation of the PPP application online. They do have Spanish, they do have a lot of languages, but it's not universal. So if that is a challenge, you are going to need to overcome that by working with individuals in your own network likely. But again, want to repeat, there are many lenders that are looking to help get farmers and other small businesses through this application process. Who has agreed to offer PPP loans? SBA does keep an updated list on their website. It is actually a very long list for Minnesota, so you can click through. It has all of the lenders across the US and it's organized by state. But sometimes a list doesn't give you all the details that you need. So if you're still pondering about where you should go for a PPP loan, forgivable loan, and you don't have an existing relationship, I would really recommend, if you feel comfortable, ask your fellow farmers, ask your fellow small business owner friends, who did they work with and did they have a good experience? Because that might be a really good sign that that is a lender that you're going to want to work with.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about the requirements for getting your loan forgiven. And I think this is one of the things that, we've heard a lot of farmers who traditionally carry a lot of debt just don't want another loan. And so I think the rules around forgiveness are really important to understand so that you can maximize and again, to repeat it, you can get the entire loan, the principal and interest forgiven if you meet all of the requirements. And so these requirements, I will say, they have changed recently. And again, in the sort of ever-evolving rules surrounding these programs, I think the forgiveness is currently one of the most confusing pieces just because they have been changing the rules. The good news is that the rules are changing for the better. They're making it easier to get more of your loan, if not all of it, forgiven. So the latest rules, the bulk of them came out with the Flexibility Act on June 5th. And so what that did is, traditionally you had 8 weeks during which you needed to spend your PPP loan. They extended that to 24 weeks. So effectively what that means is you have 24 weeks to spend 2.5 months worth of your payroll costs. So it's a much longer time frame to use that money. There are some requirements on what you spend that money on in order to receive that full forgiveness. And so these have also changed. As it stands now, you must spend at least 60% on those payroll costs. So 60% of the loan that you receive, you spend it over those 24 weeks on your payroll. And then the other 40% can be spent on utilities, mortgage interest, or rent. And the one kind of caveat I want to add to that other 40%, sort of those other expenses, if you are a self-employed person, you needed to have been able to deduct those utility, mortgage interest, or rent payments on your 2019 tax forms in order for them to qualify for the forgiveness. And again, it just seems like SBA is really looking to try to figure out how do we make sure that people aren't gaming the system when they're self-employed. And for better or worse, the way that they have come up to ensure that is by relying on the 2019 Schedule Act. So just wanted to put that out there. I also want to say that, you know, even if, let's say you only spent 50% on payroll, that doesn't mean that your loan is just not forgiven. It simply means that there's, generally speaking, a proportionate reduction in the amount that you receive. SBA also has put out a ton of different exceptions and exemptions that allow you to receive more forgiveness than you might think. For example, if you have an employee who voluntarily decided they didn't want to come to work because of COVID-19, or if someone was laid off and you were trying to rehire them and they declined. So there's a lot of different scenarios that can play out, and we don't have time to go into all of them right now, but I do want to let you know, there's Megan's a resource, we have lots of resources, and Flag, we are updating our guide to COVID-19 programs, including PPP, and that will have a lot of detail on the requirements for loan forgiveness, and that will be published later this week. So I encourage you, if you have specific questions about whether you'll qualify or a certain scenario that happened with an employee, please feel free to reach out to us. And the final thing I want to say on the forgiveness is that, again, if you don't use the PPP loan for all of the eligible reasons that SBA has put out there, what will happen is that loan turns into more of a traditional loan with a 1% interest rate, and that is over 5 years. SBA also extended the maturity of the loans from 2 years to 5 years, so that is another change that's happened recently. So, again, there's a lot of rules that keep changing and evolving, but I think at its core, they're getting more flexible, and so I would just keep that in mind as you're considering whether or not to apply.
Lindsay, I just have one quick thing here, because it's a question I get so often. For the 60% that must be used for payroll costs, if you're self-employed without an employee, that payroll cost is the owner's compensation, the equivalent of the net farm profit from the year prior. And it doesn't require you writing out a check in the way that you would for paying an employee. It is just a simple calculation that goes into the forgiveness application as it stands now. So we're just describing how the law and the rules currently apply. So payroll costs, if you don't have any employees, sometimes that seems kind of concerning, like what does that mean? And it just simply is that recoupment of your owner's compensation.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so one of the last things we're going to talk about is, what happens if you apply for a loan or even for loan forgiveness and then you're denied. And I wish I had a really detailed answer for you. The reality is, what we know is that SBA has said that there will be an appeals process, both for denials of the actual loan itself and denials of forgiveness. However, unfortunately, they have not issued the rules to outline that process. So exactly what you will need to do to appeal and what records or documents you'll need to have, we don't know yet. But I want to just stress that, the government, historically, they make mistakes, and especially when we're talking about the SBA working with farmers, which they don't historically do. So it is likely that mistakes will be made in this process, and appeals are really important. And so what I would encourage you all to do is, while we're sort of in this period where we're not sure what the appeals process would be, just try to keep as many records as you can, so that if something happens and you do feel like you need or want to appeal, you'll have at least the records that you need. And then once the rules are released, you'll be able to figure out how to go through that process. And at Flag, I know we're going to try to keep our guides updated once they do release the procedure for appealing. But just keep in mind that there is going to be a process. We just don't know the details. So. Okay, I think that's it for sort of the overview of the program. We're going to turn it over to Dan now to give a little real life experience.
Everybody hear me okay? Hello?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right,
You're
so
good.
I'm Dan. I have a small produce farm near Mankato called Cedar Crate Farm. We have 2 seasonal employees. We did last year and we did this year. And so I decided to apply for the payroll protection loan as well. And I guess the reason I initially thought about it was I was gonna cut one of our employee positions this year when I was thinking about it back in April, because I just didn't know what this year was gonna bring. Turns out we needed the help and things were busy for us, so that was lucky. And so I applied for the loan and I got it. And I'm just gonna kind of talk you through my experience with it. So I do business with a bank and a credit union right now. And I got emails from both of those businesses about them offering payroll protection loans. And I went just with one of them. And the form was really easy to fill out. Like we were saying today, it's fairly easy to calculate what your loan amount should be. And so I looked at line 34 on my 2019 taxes and I ran through the numbers on that. That number divided by 12 times 2.5. And then I added it to our average payroll costs for sort of the typical season. And so I came up with my number. I filed for the application. My banker asked for a copy of our 2019 taxes, which I submitted to them. And like 2 days later, I had the loan. I have not gone through the forgiveness piece of that. The guidance that I've been getting so far from our bank is just to hang tight with any submission because SBA is still working on the sort of forgiveness process, and my bank is not ready to receive those forms until the instructions are very clear on what forgiveness means. So I think for as far as like a government type program goes, this was one of the easiest things to fill out. I don't necessarily know that I optimized the numbers that I could have got. Maybe I could have got, $1,000 more or something like that. I wasn't really concerned with trying to get the maximum amount of dollars out of it. I was just trying to get something so that I could hire our second person for the summer. So that was my experience so far. I'd heard anecdotally through some of my farmer groups on Facebook and things like that, at least initially, people had better luck with smaller banks and credit unions over larger banks like Wells Fargo and those kinds of things. With one of our banks, initially, they were only doing business with people they had already established business relationships with. I don't think that's the case for a lot of banks anymore. You could be a brand new customer and walk in and potentially get a PPP loan. So those were a couple of things that I heard early on, but things were a lot more, well, they're still crazy now, but they were more uncertain back then as far as what this loan would be. So that's pretty much it. It was simple. We got the loan. It was a good experience. And I'm hoping that the forgiveness piece of it also goes well. Anything else I should add? Cool. I'm happy to answer any questions people might have too.
A few questions in the Q&A in the chat, and so
Okay, this is Jane, and we're going to move into the Q&A. There have been some that have come in the Q&A section. Natalie Hoydal is going to read those, and the presenters can address them as they choose to divide that up.
okay, so we have just a couple of clarification questions about the Schedule F. And Megan, I think you addressed these.
Natalie, can you increase your volume a little?
Yeah, I can
Thank
try.
you.
So Megan, I think you addressed these initial Schedule F questions, but we'll come back to them just to clarify. So if a person has employees but still has a negative Schedule F, would they still qualify for PPP?
Yes, they can qualify. So if they have declared their payroll from 2019, or they can prove that they were in operation on February 15th and they have payroll from those beginning parts of the year, then they do qualify regardless of whether they have a negative or a positive net farm income. It's just that they cannot apply to recoup any of their own owner's compensation. At that point, they're only applying for their employee payroll and or benefits. Lindsay, anything to add on that?
No, I think you got it.
All right, and then as a follow-up, as a farmer, can we adjust our Schedule F income to exclude Section 179 depreciation and or regular depreciation?
So yes, you can amend a Schedule F. That is something that is possible, but it costs money to do so. It would have other tax implications. So then you would have more tax due from last year. It takes time, so much time that you probably wouldn't be ready for the August 8th deadline. So generally, if your expenses from last year have lowered your net farm income to a negative, there isn't much that you can do in order to be able to be eligible for PPP. Not much that would be worthwhile, that is.
So this is an interesting question. If you own a farming operation and another business, can you submit 2 separate PPP loan applications for each?
I will let Lindsay add on to this, but yes, generally you can. You're not submitting as yourself though, you're submitting for the business. So each business can have a PPP application, but you wouldn't be submitting 2 as a partial owner or full owner of the 2 different businesses. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think the key is that each borrower can only receive 1 PPP loan. So that's why if they are 2 distinct entities and you're applying as separate businesses, should be okay.
All right, so there was a discussion in the chat box about who counts as an employee legally. So someone asked, I complete a 1099 MISC for my part-time workers. Do they count as employees? Dan said they're independent contractors and not employees, but I thought I would just send that to you to confirm or elaborate.
If you're doing a 1099, you are counting them as independent contractors. And then as an independent contractor, they can apply for PPP. But no, you cannot count your 1099s as employees. So you're really looking for your W-2 that you have given to employees. So this is a governmental program. They're looking for who are your employees according to the government, and those would be your W-2s. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, though I'm not sure, for how many folks this will be too applicable to, but, when you think about this program, there's both the initial eligibility for getting the loan, and then you have all these rules around forgiveness. And so one of the things when SBA is calculating the number of employees that you have, when it's thinking about if you meet the threshold of under 500, for example, they don't care whether it's full-time or part-time. If you had 1 full-time, 1 part-time, that would be 2 employees for the purposes of, do you meet that eligibility requirement? However, it's a little confusing because when you get to the loan forgiveness, remember I mentioned there are some rules around, retaining a certain percentage of your employees during that time period. And when you go to count that, SBA uses what's called full-time equivalent employees, or FTE. So for example, if you had 2 part-time employees that you had to lay off for some reason, that's the equivalent of 1 full-time employee. And so they make that distinction when determining whether you are meeting the threshold of keeping your payroll costs at a certain level and keeping your employee numbers at a certain level.
But they would have to be employees, not your independent contractors, whether we're talking about FTEs or just number of employees in general.
Okay. And Jane asked, does that change if you're working with temporary workers? Are they still considered independent contractors?
Well, Megan, if you want to take a go at that, go ahead. And
if they're a temporary employee and you are giving them a W-2, then you are fine. It doesn't matter if they work for you for 4 weeks or they work for you for the whole year. You would average your monthly costs, or you would use that seasonal adjustment. But if you have 1099s them, I'm using that as a verb. If you have called them an independent contractor, then again, they're not going to work for this program, whether they are temporary or whether someone that you have working with you for a whole year season, but you have had them in an independent contractor role.
And the only thing I would just add on that is that to count any of those employees, they need to have their principal place of residence in the United States to count.
Okay, that's an important clarification. So I guess one more clarifying piece about how you're calculating your income. How is the starting date for the 24-month use period determined?
I'm guessing, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that we're talking about the 24-week period, the covered period in which to use your loan funds. So if that's what we're speaking about, that period starts once the loan is dispersed. So I think the rules provide that, once you have, you're found eligible, they have 10 days to disperse the money, and then at that point the clock starts. And one of again, when I mentioned that all these rules changed around June 5th, this is one of those things where if you are someone who previously applied for a PPP loan before June 5th, you actually get the choice of whether you want to use the 24-week period. And so again, that would start from right after you got the disbursement of the money. Or if you received it before June 5th and it works better for you to just use the 8-week period that was how the rules were originally written, you can choose to do that as well. So you have a couple more options if you received your loan before June 5th.
All right. So there were a couple of questions that people wrote into their registration forms of things that they wanted to know prior to the webinar. It sounds like, oh, sorry. So Jane is saying that people have been calling folks and saying like, hey, we can get you this money quickly. Is that a scam? Are those real banks and credit unions that are reaching out to people, or do pretty much you have to reach out to the bank yourself for it to be legitimate?
If it is your bank and you know your lender and they reach out to you, that's probably legitimate. You might have that relationship with your lender. There are certainly a lot of agricultural lenders that I know reached out to their clients to tell them, you should think about PPP. This would be good for you. If it is a random number that calls you up and says, hey, I can get you this money faster than anyone else, that is likely a scam. And I would turn around and run away from that as quick as possible. And there are definitely PPP scams that are out there.
And I would just add that, the way the program, the rules are written, they do allow these sort of third-party agents or vendors to help out with the process. The key, and so that can make it tricky, wondering, okay, is this a scam? And I would tend to agree with Megan. If you don't know them, I would be way more cautious. But the one that kind of, I think one way or one thing we know for certain is that even if a third-party vendor or agent is going to help you, they cannot ask you for money. So the way all the fees work with this program is the banks are paid for their time and any of the fees through SBA. And the same is true with any vendor that's going to help you to apply. So if someone is calling you and asking you for money, that to me would be that line that just says, no, it is likely a scam. And if they're not asking you for money, it's maybe more questionable. But again, I think the issue comes down to who do you want to be working with? A lender that you know or that you've researched, or someone who's reaching out to you. And similarly, if someone is saying, hey, we can get this done in a matter of hours. This is the government. It's unlikely to happen. I would be especially cautious if it's sort of like get the money fast. And the last thing we have sort of seen is that sometimes there's emails or, I'd be cautious of websites trying to pretend they're the SBA. So for example, the official SBA is sba.gov. There is a website, sba.com, that I think has had there have been some scams coming out of there suggesting that they can help you with the application. So I would just make sure, when you're going to the website, that you're going to the .gov as well.
Right, thanks. So we've got 2 questions left and just a couple minutes. One is for an LLC partnership for eligibility, how do we determine the reimbursement for PPP when we don't pay ourselves wages?
Yeah, so it depends on how your LLC is set up. Most are set up as partnerships, and so you're going to be looking at utilizing the tax forms that show how the partnership distribution has been done. That guide that I showed or referenced, I should say, earlier in the PowerPoint that SBA has created does walk through some of the differences for corporations versus partnerships, but you absolutely do still qualify for a PPP if you have net farm income from your LLC. It doesn't matter if it's you as a sole proprietorship or you as your LLC applying, you can still be eligible. There's just a little bit difference in the tax documentation that you would need to fill the application out.
And just one more clarification. Does the grant take into consideration if your spouse, who I'm guessing in this case is probably the partner in the LLC, has off-farm income?
So the off-farm income does not come into play in the owner's compensation. It would only be a recoupment of the profit that came from the small business. So that would be most likely an irrelevant part of the application. It would just be that business income and or any payroll from the LLC that you would be looking for in the PPP application.
All right, and actually we have till 1:15 for questions, so we're not quite as strapped for time as I was thinking. One bigger picture question that someone asked is, can you give a sense of the total amounts nationally that are being distributed through this program?
Well, I think what I can tell you is that the program as a whole, through all the various, the different acts and the different allotments of money, there were about $659 billion that were put towards this program. I believe, and if Megan or someone else has a more recent number, please chime in, but I believe that right now there's just over 130 billion remaining. So again, we have about 10 days till August 8th when it closes. But there is still quite a bit of money out there and quite a bit has been spent already. So.
Yeah, I checked on the SBA website this morning and I didn't write down the exact numbers, but there's certainly a hefty amount of money that is still available. And you can actually find the exact numbers if you're someone that would like to find that. I think it was an extension educator that asked that, so I could see that they might want the exact number. You can find that at sba.gov, and it updates. Usually it's about a week behind.
All right, so another kind of details, farm-specific situation. How does someone show payment if they have employees who they either just started paying in January, or if they're paying family members that don't have to be claimed?
Well, I'll attack the first part of that. So it sounds like if you're a new kind of a startup business, and again, this is where it's really important whether or not you have employees or not. So if you are a business with employees and you were in operation on February 15th, but let's say you started in January, you can, if you don't have, those average payrolls from 2019, obviously, you can use the average payroll from between January 1st of this year and February 29th. So that's how SBA will kind of determine your loan. However, if you are self-employed and your business started this year, you are essentially not going to be able to apply for PPP. And that, once again, is because they are relying almost exclusively on those 2019 Schedule C or Schedule F for folks who are self-employed.
And Lindsay set that up really great for me to answer that second part about the family. If you do not have those forms, tax forms that are showing that you have paid out payroll or have your own net farm income from 2019, you may be out of luck on this situation. If you were in business and you met that qualification that Lindsay mentioned where you were paying payroll during that time, you actually have to have been paying something. It has to be recorded as payroll. And if it was some sort of in-kind compensation, unfortunately, that just doesn't work for this governmental program.
And so it sounds like if someone started a new worker in late January, is there a way to just take that like late January through February period and kind of extrapolate what it maybe would have been? Or do you just take what was paid across those 2 months in total?
It would just be, if it was late January, then you would just have, your average would, be less than what it would have been.
So those are all the questions that came in. We have a couple minutes still if people want to keep either add them in the chat box or in the Q&A.
Yeah, something to add off of Lindsay, and I can't remember if this was a specific question or if that came in early or if this was just something that had been tossed out to me in another format, but I've had individuals ask about, well, what if my 2018 income was much higher or my 2018 payroll was much higher, and then in 2019 income went down and payroll went down. Unfortunately, again, governmental program, they're relying on these 2019 numbers, so there's not much that you can do besides using the forms that you have from 2019. There's a little bit of flexibility with those seasonal employees, so you can use some of those alternate periods in order to maximize payroll if you have some seasonality, which most of you do have seasonality to your business. But otherwise, there isn't a lot of flexibility on this. There's a lot of great things about PPP, but certainly there are challenges.
Okay, so someone just wrote, and I asked them to clarify a little bit, but are we eligible as farmers in transition to retirement? And if they follow up with more details in the chat box, I'll share them.
Yeah, so there was a little hint. Jane gave me a hint that this might be a question that was coming in. And it depends. It really depends. If you have 2019 farm income and you are still in business today, so maybe you've cut back and you're transitioning out, but you're still in business today, you still can prove that you have a crop and you meet the other eligibility requirements, absolutely, you can apply. It does not disqualify you because you are planning to transition out. Now, if you have 2019 income and you are not farming today, no, you do not qualify because you do need to be in business during this period of COVID-19 in order to apply for PPP.
And I think I would just add on to that, if you are someone who falls into the kind of the first category that Megan was describing, so you had 2019 payroll and you're just sort of maybe decreasing what you're doing. The one other thing I would keep in mind is that it's also probably relevant to the forgiveness amount, because again, you have to use that 60% of what you spent on, your 2019 payroll expenses. You have to use that amount in those 24 weeks, and the same for the other expenses. So so you might be eligible, absolutely, and then it would just be a matter of you figuring how important is it to me to have 100% forgiveness versus, a lesser amount of forgiveness. So
such a good point.
Okay, so
this question came in at the very beginning. I know it's been answered, but I'll just restate it. I'm a startup farm in my first year of production. Is it possible for me to apply if I don't have records for last year? And I assume the answer is no.
Yes. Yes, you can. And Lindsay, you covered this a couple times. Would you just like to repeat the January to February rules and interesting nuances?
Interesting. That's a kind word. Yes. So again, this is where if you're a newer business, you don't have 2019 payroll. So let's say you started up early January. SBA allows you to determine the payroll expenses for determining the amount of your loan by looking at January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. So the main bar is you had to have been in business on February 15th of this year. So as long as that is met and you have employees, they will look from that January to February 29th. And the broken record in me is going to say, however, if you are self-employed and you do not have that 2019 Schedule F and you can't show, that information from 2019, then at this point, SBA is not allowing you to be eligible for the program, though they do say they're going to have additional guidance for self-employed people who have businesses that were not in operation in 2019. We just don't yet know what those rules and that guidance will say.
Something that just popped into my head, and it's not specific to the question that was just answered, but it relates to that question about transition. If you, say, purchased a farm in 2020, and so you don't have that 2019 net farm income, but let's say it was within your family, there are some interesting nuances where if an existing business was purchased, then things get a little bit more complicated. So you definitely want to, yes, it's just more complicated. So there are some really interesting nuances. That big thing is, were you in business on February 15th? And that's really that threshold.
So another question that came in on the registration forms was about people with ADOS status, so American Descendants of Slavery. And they were wondering whether there is any sort of differences in access or qualifications for people who qualify as ADOS.
Well, I can start off and others please chime in. So as far as the actual rules under the program, there are, no distinctions or differences made. But I will say, and this is something I think that's important to emphasize regardless, this is a government program, and discrimination based on race or gender or, a variety of things is, it's not just wrong, but it's actually illegal. So that's something to just make clear for anyone who's applying. And again, we know there will be an appeals process, and that's a really important thing. So I just want to say at the outset as a reminder that, there aren't, to our knowledge, up to now, there are not differences in the rules for the programs, and the rules, you're not allowed to discriminate as a lender. So I would keep that in mind. And for folks who may be interested in seeing if that's an avenue that, some of these relief programs should go down, if there's other relief that should be established. I think, right now Congress is debating, whether to extend this program and what to do with it. And, those are kind of those political questions that I would say, this might be a good time to reach out to your Congress people. But to my knowledge, none of the existing rules in the programs address that.
I'm aware of 2 farmers and 1 small business person who applied, and they didn't get denied per se, but their application process wasn't completed because they were asked for forms that they were having a hard time generating, missed the deadline or something. Is there a formal denial that says you are denied that triggers the appeal process, or should we be encouraging people reapply?
That's a really interesting question, especially about the reapplying. It's hard to fully answer because we don't know what the process is going to be for the SBA appeals. You know, SBA has some existing appeals processes that are very specific to, you know, what kind of denial you received and which programs. But because they have expressly stated that they're going to have a set of rules for PPP denials, I don't have the best answer right now. I think it is very important to keep records, you know, whatever the situations may have been. And that includes if you know, your interactions with the lender, or if you interacted with SBA, anything like that, what forms they were recommending that you have. And I would also say, if there's questions, you know, please feel free, Megan, I'm just going to say to reach out to you too, but to reach out to Megan or I, you know, and if it's something where we can really dive into what the rules are saying to make sure that you weren't, you know, wrongly denied.
All right, perfect. It is 1:14 p.m. We had until 1:15 for Q&A, so thank you to Megan and Lindsay and Dan and Natalie for making this really smooth and landing the plane on time. And thanks, Teresa, for the welcome and intros. And I think we will end it there. If you want more, we will be posting this recording, and we will also be doing another live webinar with Q&A tomorrow evening, 7 to 8:15 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jane and presenters.